Assalamu alaikum. Today I would like to introduce Ammar Asaria. Can we welcome him with the salawat? Ammar Asaria is a physics graduate from Imperial College London, obtained his PGCE from Durham in 2012, and subsequently taught at a local school for 2 years. He is an active member of the community and heavily involved with Husayni Madrasah. And today he's talking on racism in the modern world.
Salwa. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I would like to begin by apologizing for being slightly unprepared. I was notified that I would be giving this talk around 2 o'clock today. So it is a bit last minute. I've spent a little bit of time putting together a few slides, and inshallah we will try to do some justice to this very big topic. So I thought that I would look at racism. Racism is a massive topic. It is something that a whole bunch of people now believe no longer exists. There's a whole narrative suggesting that we are past racism and we don't have racial problems anymore. I would like to oppose that narrative. I would like to suggest there is racism, and inshallah through this talk we'll go through some of the racism that exists. We'll look at what racism is, and to begin that we need to ask ourselves firstly what a race is. So what is it? What is race? I'd actually like to open this question to you and ask you what is race. And I want to give you a minute to just think about this. Speak to the people around you and see if you can come up with an idea of what the meaning of race is. And then inshallah I'll come and I'll ask a few of you for what you think race is, and then we'll take it from there and see if we can put together a narrative of actually what race is. So I'll give you 1 minute. Okay, right. So it's been a bit longer than a minute. Right. So if I could ask for you, a few of your opinions, what is race? Mariam says I should ask you to put your hands up and I should pretend that I'm a teacher at school teaching a class. So hands up if we have any opinions for what race is. What do we mean by the concept of race? Let's start here with Zaid. 1 second, let's just get the mic.
So we thought that to be of the same race, you must be of the same color. You can't be of different colors and share a race.
All right, fine. So color. Okay, so you need to be of the same color to be of the same race. Okay.
Ethnicity and regional.
Ethnicity. Okay, another big word.
Sorry, just to follow up on color, how do you define color? Because I think it's quite difficult to know if you're exactly the same color as somebody, right? Without standing next to them.
Okay, fine. What is color? One race, okay, yep. So there's this concept of one race, which I said I'm going to be arguing quite strongly against. 1 second, we'll come to that, yep. Common goals, all right, so your goals. Okay, yep.
I think it's a social construct.
Right, a social construct. Yeah, Jamil uncle? Social class. Okay, so the idea of class coming into race. Okay. Yep, Riyaz uncle.
The origin of race could be geographical. So we should acknowledge that it's geographical.
Okay, fine. Geographical. I can't spell, so now you're going to see my bad spelling coming into play as well. Any other ideas? Yep.
Race is a link to tribalism.
Tribalism, okay. Right, yep, what was that other word that I just heard? Culture, okay. All right, so we have a whole bunch of ideas on what race could be. One of the very big ones that normally comes up that actually I didn't hear. We'll put that down as well. Religion. One of the very big ones that normally comes up that I didn't hear was genetics. Okay, I'm going to add that in. Okay. So, let's just talk about a few of what we've got up here. So, we'll come back to color. Firstly, ethnicity. We normally consider there to be a difference between race and ethnicity. We say that ethnicity is something that you define yourself. So you decide what ethnicity you are. You can say that you're British or you're Indian or you're whatever you wish to be, or African or whatever. It's a decision that you make upon yourself and you define yourself as. Whereas race, we don't normally think of as something that's self-defined, but it's defined by others. Okay? So ethnicity we normally think of as a different concept. So I'm going to erase that word from the board. Okay? We've got this concept of one race, so the whole world being of one race. Again, I'll come back to that when we start talking a little bit more about color. And I think we're quite right when we start talking about goals, about culture, about tribalism. All of these things come together because, quite importantly, when we talk about race, we're also thinking about the kinds of things that define the person. What kind of things they believe in, what kind of things they make them act, what's important to them. All of these things come under our culture, our goals, our maybe even our tribes, okay? So these things are quite important, okay? Geographical. So again, race is, to an extent, geographical. If I'm in a different geographical location, I might be considered to be of a different race, even if I'm the same person. So take, for example, one of the most famous race scholars. His name is Charles Mills. He is a black, a black Jamaican. But he's not a dark black Jamaican. He's light black. And when he goes to Jamaica, they don't consider him black at all. They actually consider him brown. But in America, he would be considered black. Similarly, with some of us, our races might change when we go to different areas. If our skin color is light enough, we may even have the privilege of being classified as white. Okay? So, our race is fluid. It's defined by the people looking at us. And this concept of genetic races was something that was around very early in the 1900s and in the 1800s. And it was this concept that people are born with different genes. Black people have inferior or deficient genes. And because of this deficiency that they have in them, they're not as good or great as white people. So this concept has actually had a lot of research put behind it. And so many people have tried to look for a genetic race. But as of yet, nothing has been found along these lines. There's nothing to suggest that the black people have something so genetically significant that it would make them have a different makeup. So this concept of genetics has actually been discarded from modern race theory. And nobody would now talk about genetic races. So again, we can erase that. So it comes down to our color. This is exactly what defines our race. It's when someone looks at us and they see us for having certain characteristics. So I look at someone, I see them as being black, and so I associate them with certain characteristics. They're black, so they have the X, Y, and Z character. And it's exactly that. It's the prejudices, or not even necessarily the prejudices, but the way that we look at them and the things that we associate with them. So when we talk about race, when I talk about race, I'm going to be talking about something that's a social construct. It's classed by us. So it's all dependent on how we look at another individual. So when I look at someone, what do I think of that person? That is exactly what race is. So it's a social construct. It's something that's socially constructed, and it can vary from location to location and vary from the person who's looking at us to the next person who's looking at us. So that's what we mean by race. And it's not necessarily a negative thing. right? I could look at someone, and because of the way they look, I could think of them in a very positive light. So it doesn't have to be negative. That's where this next word comes in, racism. So again, I'm going to give you I'll give you 2 minutes this time. I'll give you 2 minutes. See if you can come up with an idea of what racism is, okay? And how it's different to race. Okay, I'll stop you there before I get told off for my timekeeping abilities again. Racism. What do we think racism is? Let's start with Muhammad.
Differential treatment based on race.
Okay, differential treatment. So it could be good.
Yes.
Okay, fine. All right. Okay, wait. So do we have any more suggestions?
Is it a group of people that are in view of a particular race, instead of being racists, doing racism is an active, it's a doing thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So racism is an action.
It's an action.
Okay.
As opposed to being a racist.
Yep. It's an ism. Okay. I heard a few people when Muhammad said it could be good that it can't be good.
I said it was good.
Yeah.
We thought it was the act of putting the other side down, as in feeling superior to
Okay. Okay, superior to another. All right. Any other ideas? Yeah. Opposing the goals of another. Okay. So challenging the goals. Fine. Yep. How do you spell it? Is it double L? All right. See, this is a form of racism. You see, you're holding me to English spelling. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, discrimination based on power. Okay, so power.
Can I just say,
Yep.
in terms of, I said it can be used as a positive way. See, when somebody's doing racism to you or is racist, you can use it as an opportunity to correct them, to educate them, right? So it opens up a door which they wouldn't have had the opportunity of, to actually tell them about what he doesn't believe in, right?
Okay. All right, so gives you an opportunity to challenge. Fine.
Challenge, yeah?
Okay. Okay. So, before I define racism myself, or I attempt to define racism, I want to play a short video. This, in my opinion, is the best definition of racism I have ever come across. Okay? It's done by a comedian named Ammar Asaria. He's an Australian comedian, and he's done a clip called Reverse Racism. Let's ignore the part where he's talking about reverse racism and look more at what he's saying racism is.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Ammar. Hey. You get on stage. You make your jokes about white people. You say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Ammar. You do that. You get on stage. You make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun 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 reverse racism? I said no. I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism, and I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources. set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries, so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture's inferior, and then, just for kicks, subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism. Marvin, thank you. You've been great. Good night.
Okay, so when Ammar Rahman talks about racism, he says this all about black and brown people, but reversing that, setting up systems that are privilege for white people at every conceivable turn. Okay? Black and brown people will never have any hope of real self-determination. Convincing them that their culture is inferior. Subject colored people to white people's standard of beauty. And actually not just beauty, but standards of everything. So that they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. Okay? And so when we talk about racism, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about systemic racism. Something that makes one form of people show their superiority over another, enforce that superiority through the use of power, and create systems that continue to keep the privilege amongst whatever they class as the superior race and keep those of the lower race inferior, right? So this is what we mean when we talk about racism. And when Ammar Rahman talks about reverse racism not being able to exist, what he's saying is that the reason we can't have white on black racism is because we can't have a whole system that's created that privileges the black person over the white person, or privileges the brown person over the white person. And because that whole system's not in place, that whole system of power isn't there, we can't have this form of reverse racism. So from this, we can see what some of the impacts are of racism. We can see that we begin to form a group of people who see their culture as something that is inferior. So the things that they used to hold high and put above most of their other things now begin to look as though they're not what the white person does. They're not what the supreme class does. So they're convinced that they don't have the best forms of things. And we see this as the British went and colonized different parts of the world. We see them enforcing their standards on other places. We see them subjecting everyone to their standards of what they believe is the best and the greatest ideologies. And we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. So I want to begin by looking, by looking at racisms in schools. So I want to see if do we have systemic racism in school? Do we see racism existing in schools themselves? So one of the best pieces of research that has been carried out is done by a man at Birmingham University. His name's David Gilbourne, and he's published a very, very interesting book. And in this, he outlines some of the stuff that he's found. So he was looking at schools during the course of the last 50 or so years. When children used to enter school prior to 2006, there was an exam that every single student would have to sit. Okay, so when they entered, they would have to sit this exam. This exam was a written exam. So they would have a paper, and with the help of their teacher, they would fill out this paper. This paper would be marked, and the students would be given a mark. If we look at the data that comes out of these exams, so this was done up to 2006, okay? So if we look at the marks that come out of these exams, which race do you think was the highest achieving race? White people, you'd think, right? It wasn't. It was the black people, okay? So the highest achieving race were the blacks, okay? So this was up to the year 2006. And that's very interesting. So entering school, the highest achieving race were the blacks across British schools. And so this was a written test. But what happened after 2006? The Labour government changed the test. They made a teacher-assessed test. So what happened was the teacher would assess the students and they would give a grade to the student, and then this grade would be the grade that they'd get when they entered school. Which race do you think was the highest achieving race after they changed the test in 2006? So after 2006, greater than 2006, once we move to a teacher-assessed test, the highest achieving race becomes the whites. So what is it that changes this test? What is it that changes the highest achieving group? It's moving from a written test to a teacher-assessed test in the period of 1 year, right? So it's unlikely that there's going to be a massive difference in the intake of students. So what's changed it? And we see this, the blacks being the highest achieving group, successively, year on year, prior to 2006. What's changed is the fact that inbuilt inside each and every one of us, it doesn't matter if we're black, brown, or white, is this notion of white superiority. And when we look at the students, when we're assessing the students, this white superiority comes out. It shows itself, and we end up thinking of the white students, even if they're not necessarily greater, but because of the way we image them, because of our subconscious image of them, we give them a higher mark than we do the other students. Right? So this is inbuilt racism within the teachers. And we notice, even prior to 2006, whilst the blacks were the highest achieving group when they entered school, when they exited school at the age of 16, the highest achieving groups were the whites. It were not the blacks anymore. Right? And that is a written test. That's the GCSE exam at the age of 16. So it's completely reversed. What happens in these 10 odd years of school that makes the blacks go from being the highest achieving group to being the lowest achieving group when they exit school? What's happening there? You can, yeah, go on, give me an answer.
Well, it's just years and years of being down, right? Seeing grades just drop over time, you're going to lose sort of confidence in your own ability.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens, right? So there is this systemic racism within the schools, right? And it's very hard to cover up when you have evidence like this. And this question was put to the government by, again, the person who wrote this research, David Gilborn. He put it to the government. He told them, look, what's going on here? Why is it that this has changed? And the government simply ignored him, right? They didn't even bother taking this into account. So whilst we could say that changing of the exam wasn't itself racist, they didn't want to necessarily stop the blacks from appearing as the highest achieving group. What we can say is that ignoring of this fact is racist, right? They're not taking this into account. They're not trying to reverse it, right? Now, I would go even further. I would say that pretty much every single subject we teach in school is racist. Okay? Now I'm going to attempt to show you this. I'm not going to bother with history because I think it's obvious. We look at white history, we don't look at any other culture's history. But let's take a look at geography to start with. Okay? How could geography be racist? We're just looking at the world, looking at where different countries are placed, looking at very basic things, right? So Sumaya, could I ask you to play the second video, please? This is a clip from a TV show, famous TV show, West Wing, that's it. This is a clip from West Wing, and it's just talking about the map. So.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Hello.
Sorry to be late.
Not a problem.
I'm CJ Craig.
Of course you are. I'm Dr. John Fallow. This is Dr. Cynthia Sales and Professor Donald Huke.
Huke?
Huke.
Okay, and you are the Organization of Cartographers for Social Equality.
Well, we're from the OCSE. We have many members.
How many?
4,300 dues-paying members.
What are the dues?
$20 a year for the newsletter.
Let's start.
Wait, I want to see this.
This is Josh Lyman.
Indeed you are.
Josh, this is Dr. Fallow, and
Hi.
his merry men.
Yes.
Should we begin?
Yes. Plain and simple, we'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done.
Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
Yes.
it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes?
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
So, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with social equality.
No, I'm wondering where France really is.
Guys, we want to thank you very much for coming in.
Hang on, we're gonna finish this.
Okay.
What do maps have to do with social equality, you ask?
She asked.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
I'm going to check in on Tobin.
Go.
These guys find Brigadoon on that map. You'll call me, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the Northern Hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
Yeah, go for it.
So many years ago when I went to my son's school, I met a geography teacher. And I said to him, why is the world map always that way? I said, well, they printed upside down. So he took me to another room and he showed me a world map that was printed upside down.
Where do you see upside down?
Well, to the convention that we normally come up with. But the other thing that I also recently said, you know, when in a movie an alien ship approaches the Earth, why is it that way up? Why isn't it this way or that way?
Yeah. So there is a massive problem with pretty much everything we conceive. If we begin to think about it in more detail, it can be shown to be levels of racism within everything, right? So I'm going to attempt to suggest there's also racism within mathematics, okay? So there's a famous thinker whose name is C.K. Raju. He's an Indian thinker. He's currently in Delhi, and he's done a lot of significant mathematical work. One of his most famous works is on the racial significance of mathematics. He says that one of the very big problems with mathematics in the current world is the way that we conceive of numbers. He says this comes from a Christian theology, okay? So it comes specifically, and when he's saying Christian theology, he's meaning Aquinas' production of the theology. And he's saying that this theology has made us conceive of the numbers as very precise things. But in actual fact, if you look at Indian history, the way that they used to conceive of numbers was completely different. He says that they didn't think of it as precise numbers, but they used to think of it as variable ranges. So he says, okay, so this doesn't sound like a significant thing. It doesn't sound like it has any significance. But he says, let's take the concept of differentiation. So for those of you who know a little bit of maths, you'll know that when we differentiate, we're working out the gradient of a line. So if we have a graph like this one, we could take any point on this line and we could work out the gradient of it. So we could take this point and we can work out its gradient by differentiating. The formula for differentiation is the change in y divided by the change in x, dy by dx, okay? And the way that this comes about is simply the fact that what we're doing is we're drawing a line, a straight line, because you can't work out the gradient of a curve. So we're drawing a straight line, and we're working out the gradient of that straight line. And mathematically, what we say is that we're going to make this line smaller and smaller and smaller until it's so small that it's just a point-like distance, and then we work out the gradient of that. And that's where this formula dy by dx comes to. And what we're saying is that we're dividing by a value, okay? And we say that this dx, we're saying that we're dividing by this dx as this dx tends towards 0, right? Dividing by 0 is disallowed in mathematics. If you do it, it blows up in your face. So we don't divide by 0. So what we're doing in our mathematical conception here is we're dividing by a number that tends to 0. Okay? And that's how the Western mathematics has got around this problem. They're saying it's tending towards 0. But it doesn't actually make sense to say that something's tending towards 0. Because when the number becomes small enough, again, it should blow up in your face. So Raju has now begun to conceive of this method using an Indian framework of mathematics, and he's shown how this problem just does not arise. You don't start tending to 0 because you don't need to. Your numbers actually have finite size. So you get rid of this problem of tending towards 0. And so Raju is one of these famous thinkers who's been looking at mathematics and even suggesting that our mathematical frameworks have Western cultural heritage within it. So they're embodied with certain amounts of certain cultural frameworks that change the way that we think. So even being taught mathematics changes the ways that we think. The other ones, if we could just bring up the list, if possible. The other, I think I had science up there. I did science in a previous talk, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. But again, science itself isn't massively racist, okay? If we take the history of the science, we begin to think that everything came from only the Western world. We don't bother looking at what came from other parts of the world. That's fine. But let's ignore that and just take concepts. So how can scientific concepts be racist? So it's not necessarily racist within themselves, the concepts. But what is racist is the way, again, that we image science. When science is taught, It's taught as being the most important of the subjects, as being something that is definitely true, as unchallengeable. It basically replaces the place of theology from religion. And that's what we've done with science. We've made it into a theology. We've given ourselves a solid foundation that we can work with. But if we look at science, it's not quite as solid as we like to think. So if you look at the philosophy of science, there is a very, very big problem with conceiving of anything. It's known as the problem of induction. The problem of induction. So the problem of induction says this. If something has happened before, I'm going to say that that same thing is going to happen again in the future. Okay? So for example, the sun set yesterday, so it's going to set again tomorrow. It didn't only set yesterday, set the day before yesterday, and going back all the way. So I'm going to say it's going to set tomorrow. Okay? So that seems obvious, right? That seems like the natural thing to say. It's going to set tomorrow. The sun is going to set tomorrow. It's going to rise in the morning because it's risen every single day in the past. But the problem of induction says, how do you know it's going to happen again in the future? So, okay, it's happened every single day in the past, but what makes it happen again in the future? What makes you certain that the sun is going to set tomorrow? There is absolutely nothing that we can say rationally that can be used as a proof to say that the sun is going to set tomorrow. Okay? And this was first brought up by, well, at least in the Western tradition, this was first brought up by David Hume in the 1800s. And he said, how can we know that something that's happened in the past, how can we know that laws of physics that have happened in the past will continue to act in the future? Right? If we now take this problem into account, that we can't know what's happened in the past is going to happen in the future, well, science is not quite as certain as it was a second ago. Right? And this is in the Western tradition. Okay, so this is in Western philosophy. But science is still given this heightened position, even though within the Western tradition, they can't put it on solid foundations. All right? There are a whole bunch of other problems with science. So firstly, it takes a Western way of thinking in the sense that the way that we think about science is we say that we are going to use only what we can image with our senses, right? So whatever we can image, we take that data that we have, we process it with our rational senses, and we come up with scientific laws. Okay? And then we put it at the top of a hierarchy. That means that what we've done is we've said that the most important thing to us is what we can conceive with our senses. So again, this comes back to a Western framework of thinking. Because we're saying that the most important thing is the material, we reject the existence of anything else, such as the spiritual, because that plays a secondary level to things like science. So by putting science up there, we end up with a whole bunch of problems. And again, this begins to formulate a different mindset within us. This begins to make us think in a Western way rather than in other cultural methods. So all of these things together, they begin to shape us. And we're shaped by all of the interactions we have. And what is produced from all of this racism that is around us is a group of people who are within a system which privileges certain races and puts down other races. Oh. Where's my text? Okay. Never mind. So, liberalism is one of the main Western philosophical theories, and actually the main theory that comes about within most of our political systems. So liberalism is the theory that what we should be aiming for is the maximization of freedom. Okay? And freedom plays the goal that is right at the top. One of the main racial theorists, Charles Mills, actually challenged this. He asked, okay, So is liberalism itself racist? Is it racist to have this conception of aiming or putting a final goal as being that of freedom? So he uses Rawls's definition of liberalism to challenge this. So those of you who know Rawls's philosophy, he has something called the veil of ignorance. So the veil of ignorance is this idea that to decide on our political laws, we should put ourselves behind a veil. Okay? So we've got the world out here with real people in it. Okay? And we stand back here. Okay? Behind this veil, we can't see the real world. And we think about what laws would we put in place so that we are not put into a bad position, so that we are all equal within the society. So if I'm standing out here behind the veil, I'll think, okay, there's some people who are rich, there's some people who are poor. Now, I don't want to be poor and living on the streets, so maybe we should have a redistribution of wealth. Maybe we should have systems that actually tax the rich and give money to the poor. Because if I end up being one of the poor people when I'm put into the world, then actually I'm in a really bad position. And so this is Rawls's idea of the veil of ignorance. But in his veil of ignorance, he misses out two incredibly important concepts. And because of the way I've drawn this, I hope one of them can be seen. We could be male or female standing behind the veil, but when he looks inside the veil, he doesn't even take into account the fact that we could be male or female. So he throws into this almost a sexist dimension, right? So men and women in this country don't earn equally, right? The wage for the man tends to be higher than that for the women. So again, that needs to be taken into account before going into this society. Also, he doesn't anywhere in his book mention race. In later interpretations of his book, he brings it up very, 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 very passingly. He mentions it, I think, once in one of his later books. But this concept of race is completely missed out. But we know, and we've seen, that depending on the race that we are within, our place, our social standing varies. So actually, how can we not take race into account? And this is the story of the majority of Western philosophers who have conceived of our notions of liberalism. There is no taking into account of race. And for that matter, not gender either, until more recently. So Mills asked the question, actually, is liberalism fundamentally racist? Is it racist because it's liberalism? So Charles Mills comes up with the answer that actually it's fixable. He says if we take race into account, if we take into account the fact that there's a whole history of racism and we put into place measures that begin to get over this, so things like giving the blacks what we call positive discrimination and all of these kind of measures, then we can start to get over these ways of racism. He says it's a very long process, but we can start to fix these issues. So he says liberalism isn't inherently racist. I actually fundamentally disagree with him. Okay? And so now I'm just going to end by spending 5 minutes just talking about what I think. All right? So you can feel free to ignore all of this, but I fundamentally think that liberalism is racist, right? It is unable to deal with concepts from different cultures. So if we take the notion of Muslims, okay? So firstly, can we think of Muslims as a race? From my definition of race, where we are saying when we look at someone, we look at the way that they look and then we assign certain traits to them. Islam is definitely a race, right? When we look at Muslims, we have certain ideas about what they're like, how they will behave, and that's been perpetuated by the media over the past several decades. So if we look at a Muslim and we look at the concept of someone wearing a headscarf, can liberalism deal with this? Okay? So let's forget about whether wearing a scarf is part of Islam or not. That's irrelevant. There's a culture of people who are wearing a headscarf. Can liberalism deal with that? And actually, the liberal narrative has a massive problem with this, because what you're doing is you are putting a barrier upon the freedom of what you can wear. And that in itself is a massive problem to the liberal tradition. And actually, it finds it very difficult to deal with anything that disagrees with what it says. Take, for example, homosexuality. Take, for example, anything that goes against the liberal values. So something against democracy, for example. These kind of things are inbuilt within liberalism, and it has no way of actually allowing these things to exist. And this is probably true of any system. Once you create a system, if it's got things that goes against it, it's probably very difficult for it to deal with them. But something is very different about liberalism. When we have people, I'll remember to put a female in as well. Okay? They're constructed of all of the interactions that they face, right? It forms their idea of what reality is. It forms their metaphysics, okay? And from an Islamic perspective, within our metaphysics is the existence of the sacred realm, okay? If we don't believe in the existence of the sacred, then it's impossible for us to conceive of God. We can't believe in an existing God because there is no sacred space for him to exist within. And every religion has to have this conception of a God. Okay? So it has to have a conception of the sacred. So there is an overlap within these regions that believe in a religion. But liberalism fundamentally opposes the notion of the sacred. All of its philosophers say even if this sacred realm does exist, it's impossible for it to have any interaction within our realm, so we cannot take it into account. And this is Kant's very famous idea of the lumina and the non-lumina. He says we can't interact with all of this sacred stuff, so we ignore it. We don't allow it to form any insight into our laws, into our actions, right? It may exist, but it can't affect us. So it produces a metaphysics that is completely separate from the sacred. It cannot include the sacred within it. So if we take into account this Western or this white metaphysics, then religion is impossible. So Scientology is not a form of religion, right? It's yeah, exactly. But I'm talking about more than just Scientology. I'm talking about Western philosophy as a whole. It's unable to conceive of a sacred realm, and it removes it from everything it does. So if we begin to allow this culture within ourselves, if we fully embody the Western ideologies, then I don't think we can actually practice religion. And I think this is going to be the challenge that we are going to be having to deal with within the next 30, 40 years, especially when we start having the next generation. We're going to have to begin to actually formalize what it means to believe in this sacred, and we're going to have to challenge some notions that the Western world has. To expand on this fully, I would need another 45 minutes, so I will leave it there. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Salawat.
I must say, Ammar, I am deeply impressed. Because I didn't do my education in this country, but I've seen it. And what you've shown us is literally something that I had in the back of my mind. But obviously not to give it a scaremongering feeling. But can I just say, I'm transposing what you just said. It was a good presentation, pretty much to the point. I'm impressed. So when you said about the Western civilization coming, Christian values starting off this white supremacist idea, you ended by saying that God is not there in the current teachings, the curriculums and whatever have you. So isn't that a kind of what you might call an anomaly? Because where are we heading? I know that science is trying to be the biggest thing, and science is flawed, we all know that. But the idea of this God not existing in the heads of people, I can identify with it. So what are we replacing it with? What's the idea? Yes, there is a danger, it's existing, because one of the things that brings it home is the patriarchal system that doesn't exist in the West. So whoever is older is not looked upon as wise, is more often looked upon as somebody who's going to give you trouble, so he needs to go to the nursing home, rather than having that person in the house and imparting their knowledge and experience. So, of course, that's sidetracking it. So tell me, what do we replace this with? Is there a simple solution to that drawing that you made on that board there?
There's no simple solution. I think we've lost our cultural heritage. So in the past, our culture would be embodied with formations or images of the sacred, which I think has now very much deteriorated within us. So, and I don't think we can just go back and reclaim an old culture that we used to have, because it's not something that's going to relate to us in the same way. So what we have to now start doing is we have to start re-looking at everything that we have, and we have to start rethinking each bit, and we have to say, okay, what are the implications of this belief? Does it fall within a framework that we're happy to embody? And we have to sit there and we have to do this for each thing, and we have to recreate a sacredness within ourselves. And I think as a community, that's where we need to be looking at. There is no easy way of doing this, and it's not a simple process. We need minds far greater than mine doing it. So inshallah, we'll see something. But we have seen this beginning. So Sayyid Hussein Nasr, within the last 60-odd years, has been working on this project. He's outlined a very solid metaphysical position, but there's still a lot more to do in the terms of embodying this now within our cultures.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks, Ammar. I mean, you covered all the main points that officers normally look for: equality and diversity, English, maths, all covered. That's very good. The thing about somebody mentioning that, will there be a tomorrow, or say, is there a sun setting or sun rising? But in our belief that we know that I've been sleeping and getting up for the last 55 years. There's no guarantee that I'll get up tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. Absolutely no guarantees. And that's where faith comes into it, the belief. Yeah, so to say that every day is your last day. There's no guarantee that the sun will get up. So the question is always, when you see, the problem is that I feel that people don't challenge enough. Whatever's put to them, they don't have this culture of challenging each and everything that's said to them by looking into it. And we need to build up that challenging attitude to everything that's posed to us. So it'd be a Western culture, everything that's coming through that might not be compatible. We need to continuously challenge. I know people get tired and they can't be bothered sometimes, but it has to be challenged all the time to be on top of it. I mean, I don't know. That's my belief. That's what has to happen.
Yeah, we need to start challenging things, but I think there's an importance of looking at the foundations first because of the position that we're in at the moment. I think we really need to make sure that, okay, fine, we're challenging it, but what framework are we challenging it from? So if I'm challenging it, let's take an example. I think it's easier to understand through an example. So let's take an example of fiqh, right? Let's say we have the concept of eating pig's meat, okay? If I ask you, what's the reason we're not allowed to eat pig's meat, what would you say?
Because we've been asked not to, and obviously scientifically nowadays, they've said it's one of the dirtiest meats.
Yeah. And this is very common. So we give a scientific justification for our fiqh laws. And this becomes a problem. This again shows that we're putting science above our fiqh, right? So what framework are we challenging our fiqh laws from? we need to think that, right? So we need to have a framework that we base ourselves within, which we then look at all of this from. And so once we've defined that framework, then we can start analyzing and challenging.
About blind faith as well.
Definitely.
There's a challenging question
Definitely.
to all blind
Exactly.
faith, which I always challenge as
Yeah.
well. Right? So that's
and if you look at the history of Islamic philosophy, the concept of taqlid within the actual foundations of your religion is something that's really looked down upon. So if you look at the philosophy writings on this, taqlid within the foundations of our religion, they will basically, the biggest insult they will throw at someone is saying that they're doing taqlid on the foundations of their religion. When it comes to fiqh, this is a different question, but on the foundations of our religion, this is just...
Any questions from the women's side? Oh, wait. Mohammed.
Okay. So I went to a Muslim school for around 10 years, and alhamdulillah, they didn't teach us a single lesson of history or geography. And I'm always grateful for that, but just thinking ahead for the future, how do you suggest that we can protect our children from the Western bias in high schools mainly, I guess?
So I think it's extremely difficult within high schools because as he was giving me my Ofsted inspection, I felt very pressurized to make sure I conformed to the norms of a teacher, right? I think I failed my Ofsted inspection because there was a lot of teacher talk. But anyway, so we have systems within schools that really stop us from doing anything away from the norm. And so in terms of what we need to teach them, there are now very good works that actually begin to question the Western historical narrative, and we have less biased narratives that take into account the influences that we've had from other cultures, such as Islam and whatnot. So when it comes to history, we definitely need to start looking into these. We need to start formulating more works of our own. I mean, I don't think we're anywhere near having something that's there quite yet. Very recently, I've been seeing some books being created on Al-Ghazali and how to teach Al-Ghazali, I think. So teaching very much the metaphysics, and it's based on teaching children. So there's like workbooks and all of these kind of things that are being produced, really good work by Fons Vitae. So these kind of things, we need to start looking at them and working with them.
So Ammar, you know, of course, this debate is quite old, and in the 60s, this became quite a big subject. And then we had this birth of multiculturalism, which wanted to give theoretically equal weighting to different cultures and by implication to different values and so on. But now there is a backlash against multiculturalism, okay? Because racism has become politically incorrect, so it's being used, multiculturalism is being used as indirect racism, right? But with everything over the last 50 years, a lot has changed. We cannot say that it hasn't changed in this country, for example, at all. The attitude of many people towards people from other races has changed. I'm not saying the majority, but many has changed. So we have to see that this is a process which is very slow and complicated. And it needs engagement. We cannot ghettoize ourselves and say we will teach our children this and forget the rest. Then we cannot exist. You have to find a common ground to push.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I don't think we want a ghettoization. I don't think we need to move away from them completely. I just think we need to really start rethinking what the foundations of our beliefs are, and then from there we formulate upwards and we see what common grounds we can come with.
You said about the Western influences on us. But if you go to any other societies, like say Islamic society, you'll have Islamic influences or the teachings, and I remember going to madrasa, they were saying Muslim boys are better looking than non-Muslim boys. So that influences came too. So don't you think so? This is, we are being biased towards the West at the moment. Because this culture is everywhere.
Reverse racism. This culture is everywhere. Right, yeah.
So are you saying that other cultures are not racist?
So there is, I think, a foundational difference between the Western racism and all previous racisms, in the sense that because it's taken away this one common space between all cultures, this common space of the sacred, it doesn't give you any space to be integrated within that culture, right? So if you look at past cultures, yes, the Islamic world went around, they conquered a whole bunch of places, but actually, even when they conquered these places, the people were, to an extent, able to practice their faiths and these kind of things to a much greater level, because they were within a culture that accepted different formulations of God. Right? When you're within a culture that just doesn't allow that, it's not that you can't live, you can live, but it becomes very difficult to conceive of the sacred. Right? So you can live, and you can maybe live a very happy life. I'm not saying you can't do that. Well, depending on how you define happiness, but you won't be able to reconnect with that divine in the sense that we need to. Right, should we end there? Thank you. So what?